Welcome back to VATSIM 101, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about VOR navigation. This is something that has been requested by quite a few of you, both on the comments of some of the videos that I've made, along with on stream. We're going to break down what VORs are and how to properly navigate while using them. First, let's talk about what a VOR is. VOR is an acronym for Very High Frequency Omnidirectional Range. Now, I know what you're thinking. Cross, VOR is not the correct identifier. There are 5 words there, and there's only 3 letters. You have to understand the FAA likes 3-letter acronyms over 5-letter acronyms, mainly because the FAA can't count that high, and 2, VOR sounds a lot cooler than VOR. VORs are ground-based navigational beacons that shoot off radial signals in all directions. These signals are broadcast on frequencies that can be picked up on your aircraft's navigation radio. Each VOR is going to have its own frequency, and the frequencies are going to be between 108.0 and 117.95. Now, different VORs have different ranges that signal can broadcast for. Some of them, it can be as short as 25 nautical miles. Other can be as long as 200 nautical miles. Every radio that comes off of a VOR is going to be in a magnetic bearing. There are 3 different types of VORs that you can encounter. The first is a VOR, which is just that beacon that broadcasts that signal in every direction. Some VORs are going to have DME, or distance measuring equipment, which is going to tell you how far from the VOR you're positioned. The last type of VOR that you may see is called a VORTAC, which is a VOR coupled with a TACAN system. TACAN as a civilian pilot is not a system that you are ever going to use. That's primarily used by Navy and Marine pilots because they operate on ships out over open water where navigation is kind of limited, and the TACAN system allows them to find the boat a little bit more easily. VORs are located in all different areas around the world. A lot of them are located at airports, but a lot of them are also located in seemingly random places that you would never expect. For one example, I know that there is the Northbrook VOR in Illinois, which is positioned pretty much right outside of a public school. Now, I do have a picture of what a VOR looks like. You may have actually seen something like this when you're driving in your car. So a VOR beacon is going to look something like this. This one's on an elevated platform, which a lot of them aren't, some of them are. But if you've ever driven your car and you've seen a building that sort of looks like this, you have found a VOR. There are 2 different types of instruments on board your plane that are going to be able to track a VOR. The first one, and probably the most common that you're going to see, especially when you're just starting out in your flying career, is going to be the course deviation indicator, or the CDI. We really love 3-letter acronyms in aviation. With this instrument, you're going to spin the omni-bearing selector knob, or the OBS knob, to the radial that you want to track. The CDI needle is going to give you your position relative to the desired track. The dots on the lower portion of the CDI are going to be in increments of 2 degrees off course. So if the CDI needle is 2 dots to the left, that means you're going to be 4 degrees off course to the right. There's also going to be a to and a from indication on the right-hand side of the CDI. This is going to tell you whether you are tracking to or from the VOR station. Now, one of the sort of drawbacks to using a CDI is prone to a phenomenon called reverse sensing. We're going to talk a little bit more about what reverse sensing is later on in this video. The horizontal situation indicator combines the CDI with your heading indicator. HSIs are going to be a lot easier to read and for you to interpret where you are in relation to the VOR and be able to track it properly. I personally have never flown a plane that has an HSI in it, mainly because the biggest plane that I've ever flown is a Cessna 206. But a lot of more complex airplanes that don't have GPS systems, in most cases, are going to utilize an HSI. So once again, I'll kind of step out of the video here so you can see exactly what these different instruments are. I definitely didn't just step on the headset wire right there. So on the top, you're going to have the course deviation indicator, and on the bottom, you're going to see the HSI. So let's talk about how we're going to start tracking towards a VOR. The first thing we're going to want to do is tune to the VOR frequency. The VOR frequencies can be found on your charts. It's going to tell you the name of what the VOR is, it's going to give you the frequency, and then right underneath it, it's going to have a Morse code identifier. You're going to tune that frequency into your radio, and then you're going to turn the volume up on your navigation equipment, and you're going to listen to make sure that the Morse code frequency that you are hearing is the frequency that matches the chart. Now, with a lot of modern equipment even like the Garmin G1000 and some of your more complex airliners, they're going to have a system on board that is going to do that for you without having to listen to the VOR station, and it's going to give you the identifier of the VOR on the display to confirm it's tracking the correct VOR. The next thing you're going to want to do is spin the OBS selector until the CDI needle centers. If you see a 2 indication, that means you're going to want to fly that heading to the VOR. If a from flag appears, that is going to tell you what your position is in relation to the VOR. So for example, you spin that needle, you get a from indication, and 180 is at the top of the CDI. That means you are positioned 180 degrees or to the south of the VOR. The easiest way to remember this is that whatever direction the arrow is pointing is the heading you're going to want to fly to get to the VOR. Whenever you're spinning that OBS needle to figure out exactly where that VOR is and what radial you need to track, you're ideally going to want to have that centered with a 2 indication. When you're tracking along the radial, you want to make small course corrections to keep yourself on track. You really don't want to deviate left or right more than 10 degrees. So let's talk about different, what I like to call adverse characteristics of VORs, or really just some important things about VORs that you're going to need to know. Firstly, the radials are broadcast in a cone-like shape, meaning as you get further away from the VOR, that signal is going to expand outwards. It expands both laterally and vertically. I don't know where that just came from. As mentioned before, as you start getting closer to the VOR, the needle is going to be more sensitive to the corrections that you make. So if you start making corrections in 3, 4, 5 degrees in one direction, you're going to find yourself slaloming all over the place trying to chase that needle. Probably the most important thing to remember about VOR tracking is the VOR does not take into account what direction you are flying. It does not care what direction you're facing. It only cares what radial you are on. Reverse sensing is one of the things that disorients pilots the most when they start learning how to track VORs. Reverse sensing happens when the heading indicator and the OBS are not aligned. For example, you're flying a heading of 180 degrees, but you're tracking 360 degrees from the VOR. So the heading is opposite than the radial you're tracking from the VOR. When reverse sensing happens, the CDI needle is not going to represent the desired path. It's going to represent your position. So under normal circumstances, when you're tracking the VOR properly, if the needle swings to the right, your desired path is going to be to the right to correct and get back on that radial. With reverse sensing, the center of the CDI becomes the desired track and the needle becomes your plane. So if you're reverse sensing and you see that needle swing to the right and then you turn to the right to try and correct, the needle's going to get further and further to the right until it fully deflects and it's going to start to confuse you. Ideally, when you're flying to a VOR, you want to have the 2 indication. When you're flying away from the VOR, you want to have a from indication. VORs also have an area known as the cone of confusion. The cone of confusion is the area directly above the VOR where the signal is very unreliable. So once you start getting within the cone of confusion, your CDI is going to deflect fully either to the left or to the right. The 2 from indication is either going to disappear completely, or you might have a red and white barber pole looking thing that appears depending on that particular instrument. When you enter the cone of confusion, it's very important that you maintain the heading that you're on. Don't chase that needle left or right, because if you do, you're just going to be slaloming all over the place, and effectively what you're going to be trying to do is to fly in a very, very tight circle over that VOR. As you pass the VOR, the 2 indication is going to flip to a from indication, and then you can track the radial as normal. Another area similar to the cone of confusion is what's called the line of ambiguity. Those are going to be the radials 90 degrees from the one that you're tracking. So for example, if you are tracking 360 degrees to the VOR, your lines of ambiguity are going to be on the 270 and the 90 degree radials. So if you're passing the VOR several miles away from it, that to and from flag is going to disappear. There's not too many circumstances where you're going to encounter the line of ambiguity. You're going to find yourself in the cone of confusion way more than in a line of ambiguity, but it is something that you do want to be aware of. So there's a couple of different ways that you can navigate with VORs. The first one, and what I've done quite a bit in my real world flying, is navigating VOR to VOR, meaning that you're going to fly to one VOR, then you're going to track a different VOR and fly out to that one. Now, a lot of times when you're navigating from VOR to VOR, the radials that you're traveling on form airways. If they do, they're going to be on your charts, and the easiest way to think of what an airway is, it's a highway in the sky. When When we take a look at the charts later, you'll see exactly what I mean. Now, intersecting radials from VORs sometimes form intersections. So for example, if we have VORA and VORB, if you were to draw two converging lines from them, the point at which those radials meet forms an intersection or a fix. Now, you can either use fixes that are charted, or you can kind of make your own improv fixes to help you navigate a little bit easier. You can also use what are called DME arcs to keep yourself out of certain areas or away from certain airspace. If there is an airport that has a VOR at it, and let's say the airspace is a 10-mile radius around that airport, you can set yourself up to fly a circle around that airspace to ensure that you're not going to fly through it. The DME arcs are a little bit more complex, and a lot of pilots kind of groan when they hear DME arcs because they can be kind of complicated, but it is one of the tricks that you can use if you know how to do them. Hi, I switched over to the VRM because trying to do this with hand trackers was an absolute nightmare. So this right here is the VOR simulator that you can use to help you learn how to track VORs and how you can expect it to behave depending on different circumstances that you find yourself in. This particular simulator is from the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Embry-Riddle mentioned. Up at the top, we have the slider to change the aircraft's heading, and then on the bottom, we have the slider to change the bearing selector on the CDI. So let's say we wanted to start flying directly to this VOR. We're going to turn our OBS selector until the needle centers. So right about there. So to start tracking to this VOR, we would need to fly a heading of 070. And remember, the flag is going to point to the heading that you want to fly. So if we turn the aircraft's heading to 070, that's about the direction that we need to go to start flying to that VOR. And if we start moving the plane to the left or the right, you're going to see the needle swinging left and right. So if we get a little bit to the right of our course, the needle swings to the left. So in order to get back on course, we would need to adjust the airplane's heading to the left in order to start tracking inbound back onto our radial. Now, if we try this again, and let's just bring our plane down over here, if we center the CDI with a from indication right about there, and we turn our plane inbound, you're going to see the from indication point down to about 020. So again, the arrow is going to point to the direction that you want to fly. So we're going to turn our aircraft to a heading of 020. Now, if we start to get to the left or to the right, of course, I'll just bring our plane a little bit over here to the left, you're going to see that the needle starts swinging out towards the left. And if we were to turn to the left to try and correct our course, the needle gets further and further away from the left, which may get a little confusing. The needle's to the left, I need to turn left, but the needle is not coming back. This is reverse sensing. So here, rather than the plane being at the center of the CDI, the desired path is in the center of the CDI, and your airplane is now represented by this line. So always ensure whenever you are flying to the VOR that you have a to indication. So I'm going to bring the plane over here, and we're going to turn it. So we're going towards the VOR, and then we're going to center this CDI needle. So we want to fly a heading of about 300 degrees to track inbound to the VOR. Now, if we start moving to the left or to the right, you're going to notice that needle really doesn't move a whole lot. But as we start getting closer to the VOR, you're going to notice that for little tiny movements, that needle is swinging pretty wildly. And this is because as you get closer to the VOR, that cone-shaped signal starts to get very narrow. So as you get very close to the VOR, you want to make sure that you're not chasing this needle. You don't want to be wildly off course while you're doing it, but you don't want to make any erratic corrections to the left or to the right, because all you're going to do is slalom around as you're getting to the VOR. Now, as we pass the VOR, so we'll fly just about on top of it, you're going to notice that the needle is going to fully deflect in one direction or the other, and as we pass directly over the VOR, there's this little red sort of barber pole thing that you can kind of see. It's kind of sensitive. I'm trying to get it to display here, but you'll see that there's this little red and white barber pole. This is when we start to enter that cone of confusion, and you really don't want to start trying to chase this needle. Once you pass over the VOR, the to indication is going to flip from a from indication, and then as you start getting further away, that needle is going to start to recenter itself, and then you can adjust as needed to stay on that radial. And again, if we start to get a little off course, you're going to see that the needle starts to deflect to the right as we get a little bit to the left of course. So if we move back to the right, that needle swings back towards the center. Now you'll notice if I have this plane centered on this radial, no matter what direction I turn the plane, that CDI is gonna stay centered because the VOR doesn't care what direction you're facing. The VOR only cares what radial you're tracking. And now I'll show you an example of that line of ambiguity that we talked about a little bit earlier. We'll just track north right here and we'll start flying south. So as we start to pass the VOR from a considerable distance away, as we get to the 270-degree radial, you see that barber pole pops up again. Kind of like when we were in the cone of confusion. So a similar sort of phenomenon happens when we cross 90 degrees from our desired radial. And again, the line of ambiguity is not something that you are going to encounter a whole lot of, but just in case you see it and you get confused, this is why it's happening. Now here we have a sectional chart around the Nantucket, Cape Cod, Massachusetts area. So on this chart, you're gonna see a whole bunch of different VORs. Right down over here, we have the Nantucket VOR, pretty much right next to the Nantucket Airport. And then out over here to the west, we have the Martha's Vineyard VOR, which is right at the Martha's Vineyard Airport. There's a little dialog box right beneath the airport. It says VOR DME. This means this is a VOR that has distance measuring equipment. It gives you the name of the VOR, Martha's Vineyard, the frequency that you can tune to it on, 114.5, and then all the way to the right, it's got the Morse code identifier for the VOR, which is MVY. So when you tune to this frequency on your navigation radio, you're going to turn the volume up, and this Morse code identifier is what you're going to be listening for. And you're going to read it from top to bottom. So the M is dash dash, the V is dot 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 dash, and the Y is dash dot dash dash. Now, in between these two VORs, you can see that there is this airway, which is Victor 146. This airway is formed off of the 119-degree radial from the Martha's Vineyard VOR and the 300-degree radial from the Nantucket VOR. Now, certain radials from VORs are also going to create intersections or fixes. So if we take a look up here, we have this fix right here called peak, which if we just trace this radial all the way back, it's going to be from the Providence VOR, 115-degree radial, and 228-degree radial from the Marconi VOR. Another one that we can look at is this fix right here called Gales, which is formed off of the 349-degree radial from the Nantucket VOR and can either be tracked from the 93-degree radial from the Providence VOR, or it can be tracked from the 154-degree radial from the Boston VOR. So this one gives you a couple of different ways that you could track that particular fix. And that'll wrap up today's VATSIM 101 video, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning into today's lesson. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to leave them in the comments section down below. We will see you all for the next lesson, and until then, this is Cross Hyperu, signing out.